It's Sunday, April 16th, 2017, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we're joined by one of our mentors, Andy Wadhwa, Senior Director of Product Management at Freedom Financial Network, to lead a talk on productivity hacks for product managers. So let me just briefly explain the format for those of you who might be joining us for the first time today. So we have mentors and mentees all around the world where they get paired up one-on-one for a period of 6 months. The person you have speaking today is one of those mentors. And so we occasionally have mentors and mentees from the program joining us in the room. And the rest of you are probably joining us at theproductmentor.com/live. And so on the top of your screen, you'll see this lovely video. Along the bottom, questions, a place to put your questions. So as Andy talks, if you have questions that are topically related, I'll jump in and pass those questions along to Andy so we can get those questions answered fairly real time. For those questions that are a little bit more generic, what is product management? Is the earth round? Those types of questions, we will still ask Andy and see what he says for the answers, but we'll save the more generic ones for the end of the talk. So let me just do some quick introductions and then we'll get it kicked off. So Tofi, we'll hand it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you a mentor or mentee?
Hey everyone, my name is Tofi. I'm a mentee, and I work at Blue Sky, where we build enterprise software here in Mexico City.
Excellent. And so again, I am Jeremy Horn, aka the Product Guy, and I'll be moderating here today. And with all that said, let me hand it over to Andy to tell you a little bit about himself and to start the talk on productivity hacks for product managers.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy, for that introduction. And really look forward to talking about this topic. And hopefully all of you find it to be a good use of your time. Just a little bit about myself. I'm currently based out in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and I'll be teeing up my presentation here in just a minute, and I have a brief introduction on there. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay. And hopefully this is showing up fine on everybody's ends. If not, Jeremy, let me know. So productivity hacks for product managers is the title of my presentation. And before I dive into it, just thought it would be good to sort of tee up the conversation with a brief introduction of sort of how I've got into product, what it is I do, and also provide some context on sort of how that's leading me to talk about this topic today. So, I've been in product for well over 10 years, working as a product leader. I've, worked at a combination of startups and mid-sized companies throughout my career, spread across the B2C and B2B space, some of which you could see on this slide over here. My background coming into product management was as a computer science undergraduate major. And then when I probably worked for 4 or 5 years as a product manager, I decided to go part-time to study at business school, where I got my MBA. And for those of you who are interested or considering B school, I generally found it a great investment for me career-wise. As I've grown, though, as a leader and sort of made it through the ranks from a product manager to a director to a VP of product, what I've witnessed is that there's just been a huge proliferation in my responsibilities. I started out from being that day-to-day tactical person focused on working on a initiative, and that slowly, quickly progressed to sort of working on multiple projects, contributing strategically over time to them. And then I was at a point in my career where I was hiring and managing a team of product managers and coaching them, developing, organizational processes for them to succeed. And then, since then, as I've sort of developed areas of mastery around product, I've also become sort of a key leadership contributor in other areas beyond product itself. And so, as I've sort of taken on, all of these areas of responsibility, what I've also learned that it's impossible to sort of do all of these things successfully without scaling as a leader And I've really had to rethink, how I work and spend my time in order to continue to be able to deliver the results I need to in my role. And so before I sort of dive into sort of the specific productivity hacks that I've sort of employed to scale, here's sort of where I was as I started to take on more and more responsibilities. I think I started to see a number of challenges, and I was at a point where literally, as you can see in this picture here, I was starting to drown at first, where, if I were to walk through the items on this list here, I was fighting sort of daily fires rather than making headway on my product work. So, vast majority of the time, a lot of time was being spent sort of solving production issues, dealing with irate customers from time to time. And that was just, not allowing me to sort of focus on the day-to-day just because of the occurrences of how often these were happening. There were also days where my entire calendar was filled with meeting invites to meetings. And while that early on made me feel really important that so many people wanted me to have, wanted to have FaceTime with me during those conversations, I realized that over time that it just ended up being a huge time suck. And then same with sort of email, IM, being inundated with those just made it very distracting for me to get make any progress on any of the work I was working on. And there were times when I just ended up, getting distracted every 5 or 10 minutes, during the day, and became sort of this compulsive email checker where literally every few minutes I was refreshing and reloading my inbox, checking for updates and jumping on emails to respond to right away. And then what that led to was, I ended up, having way too many priorities to work on because I was compulsive about resolving everything quickly. Everything was important, so everything needed to get done right away. And I had a never-ending list of tasks to work on. I was a task junkie, if I were to use that as a word. Multitasking to the nth degree, with my goal of clearing out my never-ending list of tasks. And that, gradually led to those late nights of work or catching up over the weekend, and that ended up becoming, rather than an exception, sort of a normal part of life. And it sort of started to infringe on my personal life as well, which made it challenging to deal with. And while all of this was actually happening, I also want to stress that I was still doing very well career-wise and receiving great reviews from my boss and peers. But within me, I began to realize that what I was doing was really unsustainable. I had become this go-to person for way too many things. For every little thing, it was, far easier for people to just involve me, primarily because of how proactive I was, rather than attempt to resolve it through other means. And what that meant was I sort of became the answer to every problem. So if there was a bug with a product, it was like, hey, let's get Andy on it. Or we need to deliver a demo to a client tomorrow, so let's have Andy do that. He knows the product. Or I need access to a Slack channel or even a Jira board. I'm not sure how to do it, but maybe Andy can help with that. So let's ask him. So what ended up happening through all of this is, I ended up having less and less time to get actual work done, and started to get buried with all of these other things. And a huge part of it was I was becoming everything to everyone. So what I began to do was recognize that I had to make some proactive changes to stay afloat and manage myself better. And what I'm going to share with you today aren't things that I've just realized, adopted overnight. They've come through a number of years of really reflecting and sort of trying to develop myself better personally. They've also required a lot of discipline and focus, because it's always easy to go back to old habits, which in my case was to, in many cases, be reactive and fly by the seat of my pants. And I found that to be really fun at times, to do things by instinct. Being busy is also, a huge status symbol sometimes of hustle and achievement. And for me, it never gave me the opportunity to really stop, think, be mindful about sort of what it is that I'm really doing and have control over, what I was doing, and ask myself, am I really enjoying it? Is it really meaningful to what I'm really looking to accomplish in my career longer term? Or even just take that mental break to sort of relax and take a step back to have sort of some downtime. And so once I started to, recognize that was, a problem for me, I started to sort of cultivate just more of an awareness, daily awareness practice to step out of the reactivity, and that helped me really see that there were choices in how I spent my time. And then, I began to realize that, if I really wanted to make progress towards sort of my longer term career, there were, I needed to pick on fewer higher impact things to work on and really focus on getting those done on time and make some proactive lifestyle choices as well as what was important to me as a person in order to stay balanced and fresh and sort of remain on the top of my game. So the other thing I want to just call out here is sort of this myth of multitasking. This has, so often been something that you see called out in job descriptions, and you see it mentioned all the time that it's important to be an effective multitasker. But, what I've come to realize from having done this for a number of years is that, I'm far more productive and I can focus and do no more than one or two things at a time. And the chart I have on here on this slide is actually from an agile training I just recently went through, and we talked a lot about sort of multitasking within product and engineering teams, and sort of how productivity starts to dovetail as soon as you go beyond working on more than 2 projects at a time. So if you have a sprint, you're working towards, the general recommendation based on a lot of these studies is to have no more than 2 projects as your work in progress. And the 2 is mainly because if you do get stuck on one project, you at least have something else to shift your time towards. And it also helps as sort of a creative outlet so that you don't just completely get burnt out by working on one thing. It's nice to sort of be able to juggle a little bit back and forth, but anything beyond that just ends up being a huge productivity loss on your team as well as on an individual level. So this is, sort of dawned on me over the number of years that I've, done this, that it's important to really take a step back and really focus on, doing fewer things, but really getting them done better. So what I have today to share is really my top 9 productivity hacks. If I had 10, it would seem a little too perfect, but when I tallied up the ones I've applied, they tallied up to number 9. Some of these are actually interrelated as well. So if you do end up doing one of them, you may realize that you might indirectly be doing 2 or 3 of these, which is actually great. But there are 9 of these I'll be going through today. So if you were to dive into these, starting with the first one, which I called say no. This was actually one of the toughest things for me to adapt to, which is sort of coming up, getting attuned with the art, essentially, of saying no, because I was essentially someone who was always eager to help and be at the center of everything important. And so, for me personally, this was probably the most toughest one to adapt towards. And I've done this in a few different areas, and I'm going to call each of these out here. So when it came to meetings, there were many of them that I began to realize just trying to get use of time, and I decided to start politely declining them. And these were the ones where they didn't have a clear agenda or a goal or decision to be made. So it wasn't clear exactly how the people in the room were going to contribute, including myself. There were some meetings where there were more than 12 to 15 people invited, and I generally find that when you have too large of a group of people in a meeting, it's likely that nothing will get accomplished. So that's another time when you can sort of look at the trade-off between time spent in a meeting versus working on something else, being not a good trade-off to actually attend a meeting. And then lastly, if you don't have a clear way of contributing to that discussion, then that might be another meeting that's probably not a good use of your time. So what I generally ended up doing was starting to turn down those meetings. In a few cases, I would get a response back from the organizer of that discussion that would explain why I was needed. And I would change my response accordingly. But really 90 or 95% of the time, I didn't hear anything back. And in some of those cases, I would hear after the fact if there were any important action items for me that needed my attention. But I was still able to work on those later on. So I didn't find that I was losing out by not attending those discussions. The other aspect of saying no is sort of goes back to the point I was making about sort of being this go-to person on the product team, right? So trying to avoid becoming that information filter or bottleneck where people come to you all the time, and trying to empower others was really sort of the next aspect of this. So the challenge here that I was presented with was, this, rather than changing my own habits by itself, it also involves sort of changing the way other people think and perceive you, right? So for me, one specific thing I did here was to really focus on, the way I interacted and communicated with others, and to really think about, how those interactions could better educate and empower people to discover things on their own. One specific example of this was when I began to notice that the same question would pop up again and again. It was important for me to have a process to make sure that these things were documented on a wiki, for example, and we use Confluence at our current company. So that way people can actually have a way of getting to the answer, or at least discovering the answer on their own by going to the appropriate pages on the wiki. And in other cases, I started to get people just get used to waiting for an answer rather than trying to jump on things right away to respond to. And this is more of a deliberate choice of sort of letting people sort of discover things on their own when they recognize that they're not going to get an immediate answer. They start to think about sort of how they would go about, solving a problem. And especially as a leader and a manager, it's important to give people that space to sort of discover how to solve a problem on their own, and sometimes even, let them fail and trust that they'll learn through that process. And then lastly, being able to set boundaries on what you're going to commit to. And, as a perfectionist and somebody who wants to take on as much as possible on their shoulders, it was hard for me to admit that I didn't know how to do something at times, or I wasn't the best possible person to be working on certain things, right? And so as I've grown to be more of a leader, it's been important for me to think about, how I can leverage others and help them share some of that burden of responsibility, and to really think about the act of asking for support and openly receiving it as being sort of a skill to cultivate over time. And also admitting that sometimes you don't always have the answers, and to be able to identify those things early on so that you can get help as quickly as possible. I think that's, it kind of goes counterintuitive to sort of how we're all wired, but these are some of the things that I've, personally found helpful around sort of being able to not necessarily always be the person for all of these things. The next aspect of sort of thinking about how to be more productive is really to spend time thinking about where you're spending your time on projects and tasks, right? So as leaders, we have multiple ways in which, we can leverage resources. We've got time, we've got dollars, and we've got people, right? So we can often find more people and more dollars, but it's pretty impossible to manufacture more time to get something done, right? So in my world, because I had this long task list, I really needed to sit down and think about how to prioritize the work I was doing. And what I still do to this day is really try to break out my tasks and separate sort of the urgent from the important. And the way I sort of think of the important activities they are the ones that sort of help me achieve sort of my goals. These are sort of the longer term strategic activities for you as well as your organization. The urgent ones are the ones that sort of demand immediate attention. And they're usually associated with achieving someone else's goals. They're also the ones that we naturally tend to concentrate on immediately because the consequences of not dealing with them are also immediate. And so when you start to sort of break down each of those types of tasks across these 4 quadrants, what I begin to see is, the ones that fall into this first quadrant of being both urgent and important sort of fall into 2 categories. The ones that couldn't have been foreseen, that just, come up every now and then, which, that's sort of always going to happen. But you've also got the ones that you've left until the last minute. And these are the activities that were probably important and not urgent at some point that fell into this quadrant 2. But because, we decided to, AKA procrastinate on them, they sort of move into quadrant 1 and become an urgent matter to deal with. So I've consciously tried to put enough time into my work to focus on as much as possible addressing the important and non-urgent items so that they never ever become urgent. And that's sort of been a learning process for me to make sure I've got enough time to do that, just so that I don't have too much going on in that first quadrant. And then for the items that I just can't plan for, sort of really putting together a buffer of time, just allocated, just so that if there's anything unexpected and unplanned that happens, like a major crisis where, say, the product I'm working on goes down, you do have to, in that case, have some time available to address those things. Everything else that sort of goes into the bottom two quadrants, which is quadrant 3 and 4, are items that I essentially try to either delegate, reschedule, push out, or in quadrant 4, at least eliminate and not even try and work on. So those items just generally tend to be a distraction, and it's important to avoid them as much as possible. And then some of these other points on here, I've talked a little bit about delegating, automating, and deleting tasks. I mean, those mainly apply to sort of the quadrant 3 and 4 activities. But the other important thing has been, for me at least, take a look at how I'm sort of prioritizing these things, and to sort of, on a regular basis, usually weekly or so, take a look at this chart and sort of see if I need to reprioritize things. Once in a while, I'll notice that the priorities of these things will change a bit, so it's important to sort of go through that activity. And then the last aspect is to really push hard at trying to spread out these activities or these tasks that come on your plate across each of these 4 quadrants, because if everything ends up becoming a high priority and becomes urgent and important, there's really no priority, right? So you do want to make sure that idea of sort of where in priority one task is relative to another, and as much as possible be able to do a more effective job of prioritization. The next hack I'd like to share really revolves around sort of planning your goals. And most of us generally tend to have quarterly and annual goals that we work towards, and we do performance reviews. But I think the way this worked, at least for me, and I've seen this for other folks as well, is that it's more of a set it and forget type exercise until the review is about to come up. And then that's when you sort of go back and you try to sort of hurry towards making progress on those goals. What I've found to be far more effective is to really spend time thinking about those 2 to 4 things that you can achieve each week as a step towards those longer term, bigger goals, and to proactively write those out and use them as a way to come up with your game plan for each week. So for me, that's been really energizing, to come in every Monday to work with a clear idea of what it is I'm looking to accomplish. Sometimes, some of us may need that extra push of, making sure that, we feel the level of accountability necessary to get these things done. So what I've done in the past, and I've also at times asked my direct reports to do, is to have those goals emailed to your supervisor or manager, so that way it just gives you a little more of a nudge to get those things, spend time on those things over the course of the week. And then lastly, before I set out to sort of, redevelop the goals for the following week, I think this process of retrospection is actually pretty helpful, where I set aside a little bit of time to really think about how things went over the course of the week, what kind of progress I saw myself make towards those goals, and if I need to take any appropriate corrective measures in the following week, whether it means, allocating a little more time towards working on a task or a project that I thought I was going to complete but didn't quite get to, sort of really trying to think, how I could have been more effective at completing that on time, or maybe just, allocating a little more time to get that done in the following week. I think it's just a healthy activity to sort of go through before you apply and plan your next week out. Hack number 4, Timebox tasks and meetings. And so I found timeboxing to be a really effective way at getting more done. I think that looking back in time, I didn't really have a sense of how long it was taking me to do things, and now by timeboxing, it sort of provides, at least in my world, it helps motivate a sense of closure to getting things done on time. And so one of the techniques that actually what my mentee initially brought to my attention, that I've been trying to get to apply more regularly, which I think is actually pretty cool, is called the Pomodoro or the tomato technique. I think the goal essentially behind this is to, one, minimize the impact of any kind of interruptions to getting things done. I also, the other second thing I'd say is that it also provides the notion of taking short schedule breaks so that you're not always running on fumes, feeling that you're pushing yourself too hard. And then I think third and lastly, it sort of helps you get a better understanding of how you're spending your time, measuring yourself in terms of how long it takes you to get things done and log your interruptions. And the way it works, as you can see from this real picture here, is you sort of decide on what the task is that you're looking to get done. You figure out sort of, how many Pomodoro cycles you think it's going to take. And once you've done that, you set your timer to 25 minutes, work on the task uninterrupted during those 25 minutes. And then once you're done with those 25 minutes and the timer rings, you take a short 5-minute break. And depending on the task, obviously, you can repeat that cycle up to 4 times before you end up taking a longer 15 to 30-minute break. And then from there on, you repeat that process. So for me, the biggest takeaway from this is it's really helped me predict sort of how long it takes for me to get things done, and then accordingly set my timetable and block off appropriate amounts of time to get work done. So that's how I found it helpful. And I think there's a variety of other techniques that could also be used for time boxing. This one is just an example that's been helpful for me so far. When it comes to meetings, I think time boxing is just as critical over there. What I've personally subscribed to is making sure that every meeting I organize has a very clear and detailed agenda in terms of what the goals are for the meetings and what we're looking to accomplish. Starting and ending the meeting on time, just as critical to make sure that you've got enough time in the room to address whatever you're looking to get done. And in many cases, you may need to start the meeting even before everybody in the room is actually available, just so that you can end on time and be respectful of other people's time and schedules. Keeping the meeting on topic, I think, is also important. It's easy for digressions to come in during conversations, and it also is important to also think about having an effective way of parking lotting, putting things into a parking lot when you know that they may need extra time to resolve, and taking those conversations offline if they don't require everybody in the room. And then lastly, sort of capturing decisions and action items, right? So in order to sort of really move things forward in the time box effectively, making sure that you have a clear plan for how you're going to get to those action items, and really assigning those to appropriate people and having due dates against those tend to be very good ways of making progress through those time boxed discussions. The next hack, number 5, really speaks to managing technology rather than letting it manage you. So this was, the challenge I had when I had a constant flow of emails and messages interrupting my day. I was letting it sort of control my schedule, control what I was getting done during the day. And what I've had to switch to is sort of really being more deliberate about when I check my online notifications, and then how exactly I'm using these channels effectively to get my job done, right? So what I've ended up doing is sort of moving towards checking my messages 2 to 3 times a day at scheduled times, turning off notifications for the rest of the day so I don't see that Outlook window pop up saying that I've got a new message when I'm busy working on something else. And then also thinking about when it's most suitable to actually leverage each of these communication channels to have a discussion on a specific item or to get an answer on something, right? So trying to avoid sort of long-winded threads where you're going back and forth on the same thing. Those are better addressed either through a conversation or a meeting or a phone call, as opposed to via online chat or through an email. Processing emails rapidly. So when I do check them, I do make sure that I have a process to rapidly get through whatever new messages have come in, whether it means that I decide that that message is not relevant to me and I delete it, or if it is relevant, then I turn it into a task or decide to read it later. Or if I do need to respond to it, making sure my response is short. If it is going to require more than that, then once again, email's probably not the best medium to have that dialogue, and it probably makes more sense to have a conversation in person or to schedule a meeting. Hack number 6, don't be a product janitor. This speaks to sort of who I was as the go-to person for everything, right? And so, part of the challenge we face in our jobs as a product manager, especially where there's still confusion over what a product manager actually does, is to somewhat take control of defining, how we're perceived across the organization and how it is we're actually adding value, right? So it was when I was sort of more in a reactive mindset, I was generally in a state where I just didn't have enough time to think and really cultivate the knowledge and the resulting ownership around my product, right? And so the consequences of that really were that it became hard for me to be effective at influencing others as a leader and really being that true owner of the product. And what I ended up becoming was more of a resource to everybody else, which is sort of depicted in sort of this column on the right-hand side, right? And what I've consciously done, at least tried to work towards, is moving towards the more of the left column, where I've decided that it's more important for me to be strategic in the way I spend my time, and to really have time dedicated towards building upon my knowledge on the product, to really think about the vision of the product, the strategy of the product, why we're building, which sort of help define the what and the why behind the product, and to really be effectively tell that story to the rest of the organization, so I can be perceived as that leader or the CEO of the product. So, what I'd recommend to all of you is to really think about, the ways in which you're spending your time, and to think about how much of that is falling on the right-hand column side or the left-hand side, and to proactively try to spend more time on the left-hand column as opposed to the right. Hack number 7. This one I particularly like. I call it 30% feedback. And this is really where, I would stress that, if you're doing this right, you're working smarter rather than harder. And it can be hard to get into this mindset at first, because so many of us are just naturally wired, like myself, to be a perfectionist, right? So, whenever I had a project or a task assigned to me, I would literally, want to work through its entirety before getting feedback on it. But what I'm advocating for here is really, whenever you have a task with some level of ambiguity, force yourself to really spend no more than 30% of the effort that's required to get it completed. Usually that tends to be a straw man if you're putting together a presentation or a very early MVP of a product. And start to gather feedback early. Don't aim for perfection, right away. But really ask yourself, how can I get feedback right away? And then really start to, embrace that mode of thinking, because at the end of the day, you do want to minimize the amount of wasteful work done, right? And make sure that whatever work you're putting towards something is actually going to produce some value. And you also, in conjunction with that, want to have sort of these rapid feedback cycles where, once you're about 30% of the way there, you have sort of a feedback loop to sort of start getting feedback, and you're setting expectations with whoever is reviewing your work that this is just sort of the initial direction you're going down, and you want to get some feedback to make sure you're headed down the right path. Especially if it's a CEO or a busy senior executive, they would rather see something quick without having to provide too much guidance, and they'd be more than willing to provide feedback. So I think it tends to be a good way of sort of approaching the way you work. And then lastly, just being able to adjust your work based on sort of their feedback, and sort of repeating this process. So it's not just a one-time feedback loop, but you're sort of have multiple feedback loops, just to make sure you're constantly getting, investing your time wisely and moving in the direction which is aligned with sort of what everyone expects, is just as important. Hack number 8. This is what is known as the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule, which I think almost all of us here are very familiar with, is basically, it basically means that in any situation, 20% of the inputs or the activities are responsible for 80% of the outcomes or results, right, on a project. So I found this to be a useful tool to just basically help prioritize and manage the work in my life. I think that it's a good way to sort of think about, from a product management perspective, what 20% of the tasks should you really focus on to get 80% of the value delivered? What 20% of the meetings to attend to figure out sort of 80% of the work that you need to do? What 20% of the features or defects you need to fix in order to get towards an MVP, which will be 80% of the way there. So I find it as a useful guide to work in that direction. I think we also have to recognize that it comes with a fairly loose definition, this principle, and while it is a convenient shorthand for cutting down on the time wasted on activities, it may not always be a hard and fast rule for everything. So if you're building a product, you still have, at the end of the day, you still got to build 100% of that product, right? That 20% that you need to spend extra time on, or 80% of the time on, still needs to get spent. But it's certainly helpful to maybe start with that 20% first. That will help get you 80% of the way there. Make sure you're headed in the right direction before you wrap up with that remaining 20% of that work, and that can be an iterative process. And lastly, downtime. For me personally, I had challenges just taking a step back and relaxing. I always perceived relaxing as sort of not being a good use of time. I thought that anytime I wasn't doing something was making me unproductive, and I really felt that I always needed to be doing something to add value, and that was important. But at the end of the day, I've come to realize that being your best self does require you to take a step back, disconnect yourself from work, set rules for what happens during downtime. So turn off, unplug from all of your devices, and really, spend time thinking about things outside of your day-to-day. Your health matters certainly in the longer run, so making sure you have sort of a healthy way of making sure you exercise or eat on time, having consistent sleep schedules. So there's a really good talk that Arianna Huffington did on TED about the importance of sleep and its correlation with success in the workplace. Taking a vacation, which taking a longer period of time of being away from work, can be a great way to revitalize. Gives you the chance of looking at your life from a different perspective, and sort of the same thing with exercise as well. It gives you a chance to sort of revitalize and get your mind away from the day-to-day challenges you might be working through. So I highly value downtime and think it's important. It certainly helped me sort of think about other things as opposed to just constantly being dialed in on a 24-hour life cycle, thinking about work. And then to conclude here, I've really strived to share several tips with each of you today that have worked well for me in my own career. I've tried to put them, in context of being a product manager, but I would say that they generally apply to any professional career, right? And so what I'd also share is, for me personally, it helped to start small, pick one thing that I really wanted to change, and really work hard on staying disciplined and patient with myself through it. Breaking, existing habits is never easy, right? So I'll be the first to admit that, many of these examples I shared with you, I'm still working on myself and getting better at applying these things to be more productive. And there's probably many more things I'm going to try over time that I hope will continue to help me grow and scale as a leader. I'd also add that as a leader, a manager, and even a parent, a lot of these things help me shape myself into a better role model for people around me. And I think that's been valuable from a career standpoint, at the very least, as I've tried to adopt these practices. And then some of these things, like I've described, certainly work well for some of us. And I recognize, for example, we talked about the Pomodoro technique. It's a specific technique that I've found to be helpful, but there might be other things that may work better for you. So, keep in mind sort of your mileage may vary on some of these things. And so it's important to figure out what works best for you, and to really think about how you want to manage yourself better and scale. And then lastly, I would just add that, taking sort of control and making conscious choices in terms of what direction you choose to go in is so important. I've come to recognize that if I were to stay on the course I simply was not going to go down the path, whether it be lifestyle-wise or even from a longer-term career standpoint, I was not going to be able to sustain myself, right? So as you take on more and more responsibilities, try to think consciously about sort of what is going to be important for you, what choices you're going to need to make to be successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Jeremy, and see if there's any questions.
We didn't have any questions, but this was a great talk. There's a lot of great tips, a lot of great advice. So much of it should resonate with many people in product management and definitely even beyond. So I just want to end by saying thank you to our speaker, Andy, Senior Director of Product Management at Freedom Financial Network, for today's discussion on productivity hacks for product managers. And as always, the presentation will be posted on our SlideShare channel. And a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and to everyone else who joined us today on the Product Mentor. And don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, just like Andy, to product people of all sorts, please visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all that said, I'll see you guys all next time. Thanks for joining us. Bye.